Bonjour and good day to all across Canada and Africa, as well as our special guests around the world. I'm Gareth Blaw, President of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business. We are honored today to host His Excellency Wamkele Mene to discuss the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, graciously co-hosted with the High Commission of South Africa, the current chair of the African Union. In just a moment, I will call on the High Commissioner to do the official welcome for all of us as we gather today to discuss this historic landmark deal set to become one of the most dynamic, if not the most dynamic, free trade area in the world, according to a number of reports. After the official opening from Her Excellency, we will then invite Prime Minister Trudeau's Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs, MP Rob Oliphant, who will deliver remarks from the Government of Canada before our keynote speaker, Mr. Mene. Together with the Prime Minister, Cabinet members, and MPs across party lines, the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business was delighted to hold events in South Africa, Ethiopia, Senegal, and Kenya earlier this year. Trade and investment was at the forefront without doubt. For me, it was particularly special to attend last year's extraordinary African Union Summit in Niger, covering the implementation of the African Free Trade Agreement. Born and raised in Africa, and in discussion with my African leaders on the ground and counterparts, I believe Canada's role as an honest broker, its support for the drafting of this free trade agreement, and its open trade outlook make Canada a partner of choice in trade and in trade support, wherever and whenever invited to do so across Africa. After the Q&A with Wamkele Mene, we will go into a practical session on trade and business opportunities with Deepak Dave, our chamber chapter head in Nairobi, joined by a very special guest from Dlamini-Mntambo in Johannesburg, who will share a short presentation. And without further ado, for the official welcome, it is now my great privilege to call on Her Excellency Sibongiseni Dlamini-Mntambo, High Commissioner of the Republic of South Africa to Canada. And we'll just ask the High Commissioner to just unmute at the top. There seemed to be a challenge. Apologies, High Commissioner. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. I would like to warmly welcome our special guest, His Excellency Wamkele Mene, and to take this opportunity to congratulate His Excellency as the first Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area. He was inaugurated on the 19th of March, 2020 in Addis Ababa. Excellency, please be assured of our support as you execute the responsibilities entrusted to you by the continent, that of promoting the successful implementation of the African Free Trade Area. Excellency, we are fully aware that you have huge challenges ahead of you, but they are not insurmountable. Chief among them is to lead the efforts of the successful implementation of the AfCFTA. When implemented, AfCFTA would be a huge milestone towards the realization of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. I would also like to welcome Mr. Rob Oliphant, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Canada. He is not just a friend to South Africa, but he is a friend of the whole continent. We also have amongst our speakers later on, Mr. Lumkile Mondi, a lecturer at the School of Economics and Finance at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa. Sir, it is indeed an honor to have you join us today. I welcome the executive of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business, in particular, the chair of the board, Mr. Sebastian Spio-Gabra, and Ms. Susan Nomalindwa, and the vice president. And also, I would like to welcome Mr. Mike Morgan, the CEO of the Canada-Southern Africa Chamber of Commerce, based in South Africa. I would also like to recognize the presence of Ms. Cindy Mzamo, the president of the Circle of Global Business Women. This is an organization that was established by African women in business. It has the support of the International Women in Business, and the focus is to expose African women-owned businesses to international markets through strategic partnerships. We also have amongst our guests, high commissioners and ambassadors, but I would like to make a special welcome to the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps, His Excellency Solomon Azombi, the High Commissioner of Cameroon. Excellencies, senior government officials, members of parliament, business community, and all our important guests who have joined us today, thank you and welcome. Since the initial outbreak of the novel coronavirus in Wuhan, the world has been turned upside down. We are already observing that the outbreak will have significant ramifications on the global economy. And it is more unsettling to think of the economic devastation this might have in developing countries, and in particular, African economies. South Africa in particular is one of the African countries that have been mainly affected by this. Just when the country was putting in place conditions necessary to grow the economy and to attract investment, then COVID-19 happens. The whole of Africa was in fact gearing itself towards what has been long overdue, African countries trading with each other and amongst each other through the AfCFTA, which is anchored on the development integration approach as set out in Agenda 2063. Now, this places emphasis on market integration, infrastructure development, and industrial development so as to boost intra-Africa trade and support the continental development imperatives of sustainable economic growth and structural transformation. Now, the economic impact for South Africa and possibly other African countries is too devastating to even fathom. We are fully aware of the number of initiatives the African Union Bureau, under the leadership of South Africa's President, His Excellency Cyril Ramaphosa, to address the outbreak, like mobilizing resources and emphasizing the need to work together. The AU has also engaged the international community, proposing a comprehensive economic package so as to provide economic relief to African economies through, for example, debt and interest waiver. This will provide poorer countries in the continent the much needed fiscal space to be able to deal with the economic ramifications of this virus. Today, it would be interesting for me to hear from our guest speakers if there is an opportunity, not just for South Africa, but for the continent, given this crisis. Currently, South Africa's primary export destination in Africa is the southern and eastern regions. The AfCFTA presented South Africa with an opportunity for expansion to new markets, and it presented Africa with alternative markets for the export of value-added goods as well as services. The uncomfortable truth, though, is that our hopes for job creation may now seem like a dream, given that post-COVID-19, for instance, human contact amongst others may be too risky, and the current infrastructure may now be obsolete. Ladies and gentlemen, really my role here today is to welcome you all and hope that you benefit from the discussions that are about to ensue. But before I get off this platform, I would like to thank the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business for this collaboration, especially its president, Mr. Gareth Blow. It has been a pleasure to work with you on this collaboration. I would also like to thank my team in the Consulate General in Toronto and the High Commission in Ottawa and the Department of International Relations and Cooperations in South Africa, especially public diplomacy, for your support. Thank you to our speakers and our audience for making time to be with us today.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner, for your warm remarks and acknowledging South Africa's role as chair of the African Union at this time. It is indeed a wonderful pleasure to work with you and with all the heads of mission representing the continent here in Canada and out of Washington, DC. At this particular point, it is my great honor to invite someone very well known on the Africa file across the continent and here in Canada. MP Rob Oliphant was appointed as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in December last year. MP Oliphant is someone we know is working very closely with the Foreign Affairs Minister to ensure that there's a constructive Canadian leadership position set forth across the world, promoting Canada's values globally. Rob has led a number of legislative initiatives across Canada and major reforms that have been lauded on all sorts of policy issues. He has worked extensively in communities within the Ontario region and is certainly one of the most open, receptive, and engaged members of Parliament I think anyone may ever meet. MP Rob Oliphant, a great pleasure to welcome you to deliver remarks, sir, on behalf of the Government of Canada.
Thank you very much, Gareth, and Your Excellency. Thank you for your opening remarks and for observing all protocols, so I don't have to do all of those protocols. So thank you very much, Gareth, your team, you and Sebastian at the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business, your members, your executive. And I want to pay tribute to your predecessor as well, Bruce Shapiro, who, with whom I worked quite regularly. In this organization is flourishing now, and I've just was saying before the gathering that the chamber seems even more busy during this particular period, and I think that your work is extremely important, and perhaps at this time even more important than ever. Hosting events like this and offering COVID-19 related resources to your members, working with our government and with Canadian businesses, helping to open new markets in Africa. The Chamber continues to play a really strong leadership role during these challenging times, so thank you. It's my pleasure to be here on behalf of Minister François-Philippe Champagne and his colleagues in the Cabinet, many who have a strong interest in Africa, particularly in this topic today of the integration of African markets and the free trade organization, which we're very pleased to have the new Secretary General be part of this discussion today. My interest in Africa precedes my role as a parliamentary secretary when I was co-chair of the Canada-Africa Parliamentary Association, and I see that Sven Spengeman, the new co-chair, is on, as well as a number of our colleagues who have a strong interest in Africa. We forget sometimes that we have a number of parliamentarians who were born, raised in Africa, and who have a very particular interest in that. And I would name Yasmin Ratanzi and Arif Virani, Minister Ahmed Hussein, Joyce Murray, a South African, a number of Canadian parliamentarians whose roots in Africa help inform the tremendous relationship that we are developing with all 54 countries in Africa. Both Minister Champagne, as our Minister of Foreign Affairs, and I had the pleasure of going to Africa just before the pandemic started. Mr. Champagne traveled to Ethiopia for the African Union Summit and to Senegal with Prime Minister Trudeau. I was in Sudan and Ethiopia, as well as in Mozambique, to attend the inauguration of President Nyusi. And these were, again, incredible opportunities to meet with partners, to hear the concerns of African leaders in business, in community, and in government, and to share our discussion about priorities and the way we can collaborate. I think I say it all the time when I work with Africa that Canada needs to be in Africa, not only to help Africa, but for the success of Canada. That Canada's success, our economic success, our social and cultural success is tied to the world being a healthy, safe, and prosperous world. And it goes without saying that Africa is key to that success. I should highlight that our Minister of Trade, the Honorable Mary Ng, was also in Africa this year, and she attended Indaba in South Africa and led a Canadian business trade mission to Kenya and Ethiopia a few months ago. Canada is turned on to African interests, and we recognize that they include development and humanitarian assistance, of course, They include peacekeeping, peacemaking, reconciliation, democratic support, and all of that part of maintaining a healthy civil society. And they also involve investment and trade. And I think all three go hand in hand as a three-legged stool. And our trade and investment absolutely is growing and needs to continue to grow. All of these visits, trade, investment, economic prosperity, were a very important and central part of the discussions the Prime Minister had, the ministers have had, and members of Parliament have had. For Canada, diversifying and growing our trade footprint is a priority. We will not have a vibrant, successful middle class in Canada if we do not have a vibrant trading country. Over the past year, Canada has committed new resources to expand our Trade Commissioner service, that presence in Africa, with new trade commissioners now based in Ethiopia, Cameroon, Senegal, and South Africa. These resources will support even more Canadian companies engaging in the region and expanding their commercial ties. Canada has also been pleased to be the founding donor of the African Trade Policy Centre, which has been instrumental in advancing negotiations for the African Continental Free Trade Area. In all my discussions I've had in Africa, that development of a free trade area is critical for the success of all the economies of Africa, and that integration is extremely important, with each country finding its way to play a role that's appropriate for them given their sovereign decisions. The African Continental Free Trade Area offers an important opportunity to further strengthen our rules-based trade as a way to drive prosperity, to create jobs, to build regional economic integration, and to diversify markets. I'm so pleased to join this conversation today and to hear more from the Secretariat, from the newly elected His Excellency, who is going to lead that charge, and find out about his plans for the future and the plans the Secretariat has. More broadly, we know that a free, rules-based trade and investment environment is crucial to the fast and equitable distribution of critical supplies, such as medical equipment during the COVID-19 crisis. This is an unprecedented time, and opening those barriers, making sure that goods and services flow easily, is critical for the health of all of us. A robust international trading system will also be important in supporting economic recovery when restrictions on businesses end. We recognize that this pandemic is different than others. It is a health crisis, also an economic crisis, and that we can't be saving lives on the health front and losing them on the economic front. And that is very much on the mind of our Prime Minister as we take our international role as a country to ensure that we all have safety, health, and prosperity. Canada's been working at home and internationally to keep trade and supply chains open so that Canadian businesses and enterprises across the globe have that stability that they need, and so that people across the globe can continue to access essential goods and services during this critical time. On this, we've been working closely with partners from the G20, the WTO, APEC, and others to keep essential trade flowing and mitigate the economic impacts of COVID-19 for Canadians and people around the world. Furthermore, Canada continues to contribute to international efforts to address the ongoing pandemic by providing urgent and necessary funding, including to support those who are the most vulnerable. Food security is an incredibly important issue in the African continent, and we hope that Canada continue to be a reliable and trusted partner when it comes to food security and stability. As we look to the road ahead, we look forward to seeing the African Continental Free Trade Area get implemented across the continent. It holds tremendous promise for vibrant trade and business across all African countries. This pandemic is a global threat. It doesn't recognize borders, and it can only be overcome through coordinated action all around the world. Canada is doing everything we can to stay connected, support one another through the period of global challenge that we are facing right now. Now more than ever, we need strong global leadership, and I am not shy about promoting Canada's leadership at the UN Security Council for 2021-2022. We believe that Canada can play a very positive role in the UNSC as a non-permanent member. Our focus on economic security, strengthening multilateralism, and the rules-based economic environment will be critical to support recovery from COVID-19. We know that diversified and inclusive trade will be critical to the success of our mutual economic recovery and future prosperity. We hope that we can count on your support, each of you, your excellencies who are on the call, in this upcoming campaign. We know that we'll get through this period together. We thank you for the opportunity today to learn and to listen. And Your Excellency, we thank you and your country's leadership at the African Union through the presidency this year, and wish you nothing but the best as you hold the continent in its best interests and help us all move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Parliamentary Secretary MP Rob Oliphant, and for your very dynamic leadership. It is now my distinct pleasure and high honor on behalf of the board of the Canada-Africa Chamber of Business, our members and all our guests today, to introduce our keynote speaker, Secretary General Wamkele Mene. His Excellency Mene was elected as the first Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area on the 10th of February last year during the 33rd African Union Summit. Prior to his election to this position, he was South Africa's chief negotiator for the free trade deal and also represented his country at the World Trade Organization. For all of you who have already started asking questions, please keep those questions coming in. And it is now my great pleasure to welcome you, Secretary General, His Excellency Wamkele Mene.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Gareth, for the warm welcome. I thank Her Excellency, our High Commissioner, Dlamini-Mntambo in Ottawa. I thank also all the other speakers who are in the panel. Thank you for the invitation. It is an absolute pleasure for me to participate in this discussion. I hope I was there in person. I hope the invitation will still come for me to visit and talk to all of you in person and to express views about and exchange views about how we intend to expedite the implementation of this agreement in order to enhance trade and investment into Africa and trade and investment intra-Africa. I want to thank the government of Canada for the support, the government, the people of Canada, the private sector, and of course, civil society in Canada for supporting the African Continental Free Trade Area, not only politically and in terms of solidarity, but by providing technical and financial resources as well. I think that contribution significantly enhanced our success in getting this agreement to be ratified by so many African countries to date. I also want to make a special mention to David Luke, who is the head of the ATPC, which is really at UNECA he has been one of the drivers of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And I think all of us, as former negotiators, are really eternally indebted to him for his very, very significant contribution. He is by far one of the best and the brightest trade policy minds that the African continent has produced. We convene over Zoom in very, very challenging times. And as was noted by previous speakers, the impact of COVID-19 on Africa has been as significant as anywhere else in the world. But of course, we have our own peculiarities, which we have to take into account as we combat this crisis. But before I get to the tools that have been put in place to combat the pandemic, let me just give you a sense of where we are in the negotiations. The agreement has been signed by 54 countries out of 55. It has been ratified by 28 countries, and more countries have been signaling that they are ready to deposit instruments of ratification And it is one of my objectives to ensure that, that the agreement becomes universal in Africa. In other words, that as many countries as possible in Africa become signatories and are state parties to the agreement, so that we can have universal in Africa implementation of the agreement. It is one of the fastest agreements to ever be ratified in the African Union. It is the most comprehensive free trade agreement in the world. It shall include, it includes trade in goods, trade in services, competition policy, investment, intellectual property, and later shall include e-commerce. And the idea, of course, is to ensure that we have a free trade agreement that is that captures all economic activity in each country. So 55 countries will eventually, I'm confident, will eventually become the state parties to the agreement, which will make this free trade agreement the biggest free trade agreement in the world. But what more than that, what distinguishes it is the development dimension to it. In the agreement, we place as a primary objective, for example, industrial development in Africa, economic development in Africa, which are ideals that our heads of states from many, many years ago have been advancing. And so in 2015 in Johannesburg, South Africa, at the summit there, the heads of states directed us as negotiators to, at the time, to negotiate an agreement that will be a step towards a market integration in Africa. And an agreement that will also enable us to overcome the smallness of our national economies, market fragmentation in Africa, which will enable us to enhance economies of scale, and of course, which will eventually enable us to take advantage and to harness this market of 1.2 billion people, a combined GDP of $2.5 trillion. It is a significant market if we get things right and if we overcome the market fragmentation that we have seen. You know as well as I do that intra-Africa trade today is at very, very low levels, at 18%. And we want to fundamentally, through this agreement, we want to fundamentally transform that. We want to boost intra-Africa trade to over 50% by the year 2030. And that is an objective, an ideal that we will work very vigorously to make sure that we boost intra-Africa trade. And one of the ways of doing that is, of course, by improving our industrial base, by ensuring that our manufacturing capacity is improved, by establishing regional value chains, centers of manufacturing, centers of industrial development across sectors and across countries in Africa, sectors such as agro-processing, which are very labor intensive and have connections to other sectors of the economy, such as services. And we want to ensure we focus also on automobiles and a range of other very, very important labor intensive value added production activity. And so we intend to use this trade agreement as a launchpad to achieve those objectives and to diversify Africa's export basket, and to eventually ensure that African countries reach specialization in trade, so that we don't trade apples with apples within Africa as trading partners, that we focus on high levels of specializations, as I say, particularly in the area of industrial development and manufacturing. Now, coming back to COVID-19 and where we stand in Africa, and the impact that COVID-19 has had on the implementation of the agreement. The services sector has been affected very, very badly in Africa, particularly travel services. We estimate that the services sector will fall by between 20 to 30% as a result of the pandemic. Our exports are set to decrease by up to 35%, which translates roughly into about $270 billion. We have seen a flight of capital. Foreign direct investment flows have reduced. And we have seen from estimates and projections from the World Bank that Africa will see a reduction in economic growth of up to 5.1%. So that is between $40 billion and between 37 and $80 billion is the projected losses. And so the sum of all of this is quite significant, because unlike countries in developed countries, unlike the developed world, many countries in Africa do not have the monetary policy space, the fiscal policy space to provide significant bailouts. We know that the US has provided close to $1 trillion worth of bailouts to its its stimulus package rather, to its economy, a bailout of $60 billion to the airline industry, which will include grants, which is in the form of grants and loans. Air France has provided an assistance package to KLM of $7 billion. The European Union has provided also a stimulus package of close to $1 trillion. So this is very, very significant when you compare with where Africa stands. Not many countries in Africa will be able to provide comparable stimulus packages. So the answer for Africa's economic development post-COVID-19, in my opinion, it lies in the implementation of this agreement. We have to significantly boost intra-Africa trade so that intra-Africa trade becomes the engine of growth post-COVID-19 and in years to come. We don't have any other alternative. We've got to ensure that the only tool that is at our disposal as Africans is actually this African Continental Free Trade Area, so that we reduce the barriers to trade in Africa. We actually implement the rules of open trade that we have agreed to. Some of them we're still negotiating. And of course, that we position Africa as an attractive trade and investment destination, because we will have overcome market fragmentation, smallness of economies, and we will have established a single regulatory framework for investors, whether they are African investors or domestic investors, for investors to consider, thereby significantly reducing the cost of doing business in Africa. Let me give you an example. In the area of financial services, we will have the same rules for capital adequacy requirements. We will have the same rules for how many banks are allowed, foreign banks are allowed in a particular market. So you will know, you will have predictability and certainty of the market that you are about to enter. And so we think that the course that we have embarked on is a course that will improve Africa's investment outlook for African investors, but also for foreign investors equally so. Now, let me just conclude by in my opinion, stating why I think this agreement is different to other trade agreements that we have around the world. One of the things that we are acutely aware of and are very conscious of is the importance to have young Africans in trade to be part of this agreement. You will know as well as I do that one of the drivers of technological innovation, financial technology, all of these enabled platforms, mobile-enabled platforms that generate trade, the innovators are young Africans. We've got to find a way of ensuring that young Africans up and down this continent are part of the implementation of this agreement. Second, women in trade, whether it is organized business women in trade or informal traders, are a very, very important part of my vision for implementing this agreement. When you look at countries that are trading on the borders, you go to the border between Rwanda and Uganda, you find informal traders, you find traders that are actually accessing markets using mobile-enabled technology. So we've got to make sure that as we implement this agreement and as we create opportunities, we don't create opportunities only for the big corporations, MTN, EcoBank, that we create opportunities also for young Africans and for women in trade and for informal traders, small, medium enterprises. We've got to create a platform for them to benefit in this agreement. This is what is going to distinguish it, because when you look at the failures of trade agreements around the world, and when you look at the criticism of globalization around the world, which has given rise to right-wing fundamentalism and nationalist, chauvinist ideas across the world, of course, leveraging on the dissatisfaction with globalization and on the dissatisfaction with trade agreements in particular, it is because in many of those societies, significant segments of those societies have been left behind. So we need to make sure that we do not make the same mistake, that we take all our segments of society along with us as we implement this agreement. This is why I think it is distinguishable. The second reason why I believe it is distinguishable is because we are absolutely determined that it must benefit all countries in Africa equally so. We know, of course, that there are countries that already have an advantage in the sense that they have an industrial base that is existing, but we've got to work hard to make sure that even those countries that do not have an industrial base at the moment, that this agreement lays the basis and the foundation for them to be able to enter into regional value chains and to participate in regional value chains. And I will give you an example of this. Lesotho is a country that does not have an auto sector. It does not have an auto strategy. And yet Lesotho is part of the regional value chain of the auto sector linked with South Africa, Botswana, and so on. So you don't really have to have a particular comparative advantage to begin with. It is simply a question of us, based on the agreement, to develop regional value chains that benefit all countries and that create opportunities in all countries. It's going to be difficult, it's going to be hard work, but we've got to do it if we want the agreement to succeed. Now, what are the solutions? What are some of the solutions that there's a point that was made about the actions that the African Union has taken to combat COVID-19. First, under the leadership of President Ramaphosa, a fund has been established, the COVID-19 Solidarity Fund, which is actively raising funds for countries that are hardest hit. The second response has been the establishment of trade corridors, and we're working hard to ensure that those trade corridors, that they enable the transit of goods, goods that are essential for fighting the pandemic. Third, we are working with the African Union's Center for Disease Control in identifying essential goods, germ-killing products, soaps that are essential for fighting this pandemic. And we intend that this trade corridor must enable the transit of those goods so that those goods are able to reach countries that need them the most, in particular countries that are landlocked. In the long term, I think what we really need to consider as a long-term response, not just to this pandemic, but to any other pandemic in future, as we know there will be, is to develop Africa's industrial development capacity, so that the current products and goods that we're importing, we produce the personal protection equipment in Africa, the ventilators in Africa. This is really the key. Africa's industrial development in the long term is a critical response to any pandemic, because it will enable us to manufacture the goods that are essential for combating that particular pandemic. Second, as we look long term, we have to review our intellectual property regime and ask ourselves, does our intellectual property regime serve Africa's public health purpose and public health objectives? And does it serve Africa's industrial development objectives? And in this case, I am talking about patents. To what extent do our patents allow our patents regime, parallel importing, compulsory licensing where it is required, and actually desirable? Does it enable us to establish a generic drug industry in Africa, so that we are able to ensure that access to public health in Africa is affordable? It's been done in some parts of the world, such as India, for example, and I'm very, very sure that we can do it also here in Africa. So this is really to give you a flavor of the short-term responses and the long-term responses to Africa's response to this pandemic. Let me conclude by saying the following. My priorities when I was elected have had to change, of course, to take account of the pandemic. We had a very good discussion last week with ministers of trade, and of course those some of those priorities are now Africa's industrial development, and as I was saying, to make an assessment of our intellectual property rights regime to see the extent to which it services public health needs in Africa and industrial development in Africa. But we will continue to push on with also other very important areas, such as ensuring that we have a dispute settlement system under the agreement that is credible, a dispute settlement system which I might say, actually, what we have designed and negotiated is an improvement from the WTO. We looked at the problems that have been identified there in the dispute settlement system of the WTO, and we have improved on that. So we've got to make sure it's credible, that investors have confidence in it, and that we, as state parties to the agreement, actually have confidence in it. We have to work very hard in the area of trade remedies. As you know, trade remedies have a direct impact to economic well-being of a country, in particular job creation and the impact of jobs. If you have products that are dumped in a particular market, you've got to have tools for ensuring that you protect jobs against goods that are unfairly subsidized. We've got to make sure that our trade remedies regime is fully operationalized. And then, of course, we have to ensure that our rules of origin regime does, in fact, prevent transshipment and does, in fact, foster industrial development in Africa, across African countries. I think the issue of transshipment is very, very important. Goods coming in from a third country, displacing local markets, that leads to jobs, to job losses. We do not want this agreement to lead to job losses. We want it to create jobs. And so, in summary, I would say that I'm very proud that we have negotiated an agreement that places Africa, the entire continent, on a path to industrial development and producing value-added goods, and ensuring that we develop value chains on this continent, whilst at the same time, we remain integrated to the global economy. And so thank you again very much for inviting me. I look forward to a partnership, a continued partnership with Canada, the government of Canada, with private sector, of course, with yourselves. And I look forward to visiting you in person. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir, and congratulations. We've got so many questions coming through, but an equal number of compliments and huge excitement at the speed and the scale of this incredible free trade agreement. The first question is mixed with a comment, asserting that so much of Africa lies within Canada already. There's not a single community or town or city where each one of Africa's countries are represented in the people of Canada. Given you alluded to the role of the people of Canada and its institutions and sort of civil society in the creation of the free trade deal, what role can be played by Canada at all levels in the ongoing implementation as an equal partner in delivering on this deal? And I'll come back to the other questions in a moment.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think that there are areas of collaboration. There are areas where we can learn from one another, and that is between Canada and ourselves as the Secretariat. For example, I mentioned in the area of intellectual property rights, in the area of trade rules, the application of trade rules, we can have exchange of information and exchange of expertise. So I see a scope for mutual collaboration. I also see a scope for the Canadian government working with us as the Secretariat to raise awareness about the African Continental Free Trade Area within the private sector community in Canada, within the investor community in Canada, to make people aware that Africa is open for business and that there are investment opportunities in Africa, which are now being enabled by this agreement that we have negotiated. I think when you look at trade agreements in other parts of the world, you will see that they do create jobs and they do provide platforms for an opportunity for investment. And so that is exactly what we want to continue to focus on as we move forward.
Thank you very much. Another question from a CEO here in Canada. The point is made that it will be Africa that will be helping Canada in this mutual relationship, especially going forward, given the size and the skill and the young population across the continent. In your view, given the speed of the deal to date, Secretary General, when do you think there will be an appetite for the single African market entering into free trade deals with other countries, such as Canada or any other?
Yeah, that's a very important question. The negotiations are now, we are almost at the point of concluding phase one. I think but for COVID-19, we would have made significant progress. in concluding phase 1, which is trade in goods, trade in services. After that, the intention was to, the intention continues to be to quickly start phase 2, which is investment, intellectual property, and competition, and e-commerce, of course. So we were given the deadline of concluding all of the entire package by the end of next year, but starting the implementation in phases. So in other words, starting with trade in goods, dispute settlement, operationalizing it, and so on. Now, this has impacted on all of those timelines that we had in place. At the moment, the heads of states are considering, as we speak, the heads of states are considering whether or not the implementation of the agreement, which was and trading under the new preferences, under the new trade rules, whether it is still possible that we start that on the 1st of July, as was intended, as was the initial intention. And so the heads of states are actively considering whether or not that will still be possible, given the current context that we are in, the fact that borders are closed, the fact that countries are correctly and quite sensibly focused on protecting public health and protecting and saving lives of their populations. It is very, very important that governments do that. But I think it's also very important that we expeditiously, as soon as the conditions allow, that we implement the agreement and start operationalizing it as soon as the conditions allow. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, in the interim, we can focus on the essential goods, the transit of essential goods, the movement of essential goods, whilst we're waiting for a more comprehensive trading to take place under the new agreement.
Thank you very much. Another question goes to the role of technology. Given Africa has leapfrogged on almost every industry when it comes to technology, to what extent will that help in implementation of the deal that moves it along far faster than trade deals that have happened in other parts of the world historically?
That's another great question. When I was, one of the points I made when during the election process for this position was the impact, the potential transformative impact of digitization of trade in Africa, and which then enables e-commerce in Africa. Even in a case such as a pandemic, I think we've seen the critical importance of e-commerce. We have seen now that there are remote doctor visits, that there are digital pharmacies. And so the importance of digitization is absolutely critical. In the case of implementation of the agreement, we are already in discussions about establishing platforms that will greatly simplify, digital platforms that will greatly simplify trade. For example, our customs procedures, there is a scope for us to have digital technology that enables customs procedures to be more efficiently carried out. It is possible to have an electronic certificate of origin, so that you don't have to do all of that, the verification manually. You can deploy blockchain technology to facilitate customs procedures in a particular country, and you can centralize that in a digital platform that can be established by the Secretariat. And so the digitization of trade really is, in my view, a tool that will enable us to fast track implementation of this agreement. There will be challenges, of course. there will definitely be challenges with plugging into the platform. Some countries are at different stages of having digital technology that already exists. But this is a very, very important part of enabling and accelerating trade in Africa from the current 18% that way it stands at the moment to significantly higher amounts.
Thank you very much. With regard to the last two questions, before I invite you to offer any closing remarks, Your Excellency, the first question is, what are some of the assumptions around the model of including women, given the incredible importance of the feminization policy and of equality of opportunity across the board? And the second question is, beyond creating awareness of the deal, what should those of us in Canada be doing when it comes to understanding the expectations on Canada, its people, its government, its businesses, on engagement with this free trade deal? Thank you.
Well, I see you wanted to close with the most difficult questions. Look, Her Excellency in her remarks mentioned Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. And Agenda 2063, the Africa we want makes it clear that the role of women in trade, in economic activity, has to be recognized. And in my case, I take that to mean that I have to encourage state parties to the agreement to codify, to give legal meaning to how we actually can enhance the role of women in trade. And we can do so by establishing platforms for engaging with women in trade, and in a more practical sense. It is possible, I have not discussed this with the state parties, I may get into trouble, but it is possible that you can say that you codify it in an agreement that a business that is women-owned receives a much higher reduction of tariffs than a business that is not women-owned. So there are various ways in which we can give practical meaning to encouraging women in trade. The second part of the question about beyond the cooperation and collaboration with the government, I think the point for me is the continued cooperation and the continued encouragement of investors to come and invest in Africa. Other parts of the world, other countries have a much higher degree of investment in Africa than Canada. I think it is only probably in South Africa where Canada is the third or the fourth largest foreign direct investor. And so we want to see that encouragement of investment outside of South Africa. Of course, you remain in South Africa, but you continue to invest outside of South Africa in other African countries. This is, for me, how you give meaning to a trade agreement, by ensuring that the protections, the market opening that it provides, the legal certainty and predictability that it provides, that it does actually lead to investment.
Thank you very much. And at this particular point, I want to give special thanks to yourself and your entire team over at the African Union. I've been incredibly privileged, as have some of our members, to engage at the AU and at the various summits. And you have our public support that we will do everything in our power to advance and to deepen Canada-Africa trade and investment in every single one of the countries across the continent. And it was with that that I also thank the High Commissioner of South Africa for your role representing as chair of the African Union. Of course, MP Rob Oliphant, for your leadership that is constant and that is ceaseless I don't think there's a week that goes by, if not a day, where we aren't in touch on your incredible message to drive that enabling environment so that we see Africa and Canada reach its full potential together as equal partners underpinned by the values that we of course share and stand by. At this particular juncture, it's just gone after 12 o'clock. I would like to invite each one of you to stay on for the practical business component. We've got some questions here related to the issues of doing business and what the opportunities are right now in light of some of these developments that we've seen to date. So I'm very proud to invite to the session Deepak Dave, our chair in Africa based on the continent, heading up chapter, as well as, of course, from South Africa, Wamkele, who's going to be joining us given his leadership based out of Johannesburg. At this particular point, thank you to each one of you for joining us for the trade component. And as I say, you're most welcome to say as we discuss the practical business elements moving forward. Thank you. At this point, Deepak Dave, the floor is yours and welcome to the call.
A pleasure listening to, thank you, Gareth. It's been a pleasure listening to the earlier speakers. And I was particularly pleased to hear from the Secretary General regarding the Africa Common Free Trade Agreement. As I start to speak more about the agency whose Chief Risk Officer I became earlier this year, and I'm very proud to be a part of their executive management, I think we will all understand better why. I am now the Chief Risk Officer of the Africa Trade Insurance Agency, which is owned by 18 African governments, the African Development Bank, and certain institutional investors based in Western Europe and Asia, including the export credit agencies of countries like India and Italy. The agency provides close to $8 billion worth of cover for credit insurance related to trade and investment. It also covers credit enhancement for African sovereigns that are raising money for their own development spending on infrastructure, health, education, and improving their internal trading capability. And we provide that same level of cover for political risk insurance for foreign investors in sensitive sectors within Africa. So far, most of the business of the agency over the last 20 years has been focused on attracting OECD investors into the continent. The Africa Common Free Trade Agreement means an opportunity for ourselves as well as sister institutions such as the Trade and Development Bank and AfCFTA, as well as, of course, a common shareholder in all of us, the African Development Bank, to enhance Africa's own internal trading capabilities. Over the last few years, we had already started noticing the trend of increasing intra-African investment, country to country, trade between the countries, as well as the growth of some of the supply chains and value chains that the Secretary General referred to earlier. The spending on infrastructure has also started to focus more on growing road, rail, and waterway networks between countries in the continent, as opposed to the previous model of everything shipping itself to a port purely for export purposes. And of course, the recognition that by supporting trade and investment agencies such as ours enhance the growth of value chains which down the line have small and medium enterprises, many of which are quite substantive employers and trainers of skills within the female population in Africa, but also, of course, quite involved in industries such as agribusiness and resources, which also provide extensive employment opportunities for in low-income countries. COVID-19 has unquestionably affected almost all of the positive trends we had seen over the last few years, but there are two things that I would bring to the fore. One of which is that agencies such as ours that are on the ground and in very close contact with corporations, project financiers, development funds, investment vehicles, and banks in country across the region have seen a lot of business and a lot of business people and tradespeople treat things as looking bleak, but not hopeless. There is still an understanding that demand has been deferred, that opportunities may come out of this crisis to strengthen Africa's presence in global supply and value chains. And as we grow intra-African trade to become part of an overall global trading network, most of our agencies are all looking around at each other and listening to what's happening on the ground and detecting a sense of positivity. In April, shortly after the declaration as a pandemic by the WHO, we felt that perhaps some of the press around Africa got a little bit more despairing than it needed to be. And so over the last few weeks, all of our institutions have held several communication channels open, such as webinars, conference calls, all of that, with reinsurers, rating agencies, commercial banks, investment funds, hedge funds, to explain that the continent is not looking down into the abyss and certainly hasn't fallen into it when it comes to things such as debt relief. In fact, dealing with some of our ministries of finance, we are very pleasantly surprised that compared to 14 or 15 years ago when the last heavily indebted debt relief program was rolled out, most of these ministries and central banks are actually talking about not taking up the option of debt relief from the private sector, or of repudiating their debt contracts or their financing or trade and supply contracts. Instead, they are recalibrating their fiscal expectations and their plans to the new reality and are taking a very realistic view of what the world is going to look like the morning after the night before, if you will. And so this has been something that gives us great confidence that the opportunities that will be put up by things such as the Africa Common Free Trade Agreement are quite ready to be taken advantage of in a number of these countries and by a number of the businesses that are indigenous to the continent. I would close by saying that agencies such as ATI, which have a close relationship with the countries in which we operate, are not unaware of the risks that we face over the next brief period. There is the fall off in trade and tourism, the fall off in exports of resources, which still form the bedrock of many an African economy, are certainly going to affect the region negatively. But I would again stress that we see opportunity, not just through the Common Free Trade Agreement, but also in a world that is now better suited towards Africa's integration in supply chains that go beyond purely resources and energy. And the growth of businesses such as agri-processing and digital technology on the continent have proven that there is no business in the world that can't succeed in Africa. But you've got to be willing to come out here and you've got to find the right partners to work with. And we certainly believe that ourselves and other sister institutions allied to the African Development Bank are particularly well suited to working with investors and tradespeople who want to do business with the continent, whether from Canada or elsewhere, but specifically from Canada. So, Gareth, I'll stop there in the interest of time. If there's any questions for me, I'm happy to answer a couple, and I understand we have a speaker to follow me after.
Thank you very much, Deepak. Deepak, Dave, your leadership has been absolutely incredible. I know you left some very senior corporate jobs. You've been based in Canada, you've been based over in East Africa, and your commitment to the Chamber, not least to the broader work of trade and investment, is deeply appreciated and highly valued from all of us. I know it's been over a decade, so thank you very much. And thanks for your expertise. We've got a number of questions coming through, and we will take those questions once we've had our next presentation, which I'm very, very honored to welcome our next speaker. Mr. Wamkele Mene is someone I had the privilege of speaking with before this call. He serves as someone influencing thought on trade and investment, but also does the work day to day with his executive leadership across a host of businesses operating throughout the continent. Besides his role at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg as a senior strategist, Mr. Mene is also, as a senior lecturer, he's also a strategist, an economist, and a leader working across the continent. His responsibilities have been with the Industrial Development Corporation for 11 years, with various infrastructure, capital funds, and with a host of other organizations, including various metals companies. More than 20 years of postgraduate experience and 7 years working in financial markets has seen him serve with BRICS think tanks in strengthening institutions and coordination. I don't think there's a prestigious institute in the world where he has not presented with various conferences, including the UN, the World Bank, and others. Mr. Mondi, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today for your presentation.
Good evening, Your Excellencies, all protocol observed. I'm going to talk about what underpins the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, specifically focusing on electricity as an interconnector for Africa's development. Gareth, am I clear? Can I be heard?
Very clear, thank you.
Thank you so much. So, as you can see, if you can see my graph, you will see that if you look in the African continent, we're much more dark.
So sorry to interrupt. So unfortunately, we can't see the graph at the moment on the screen.
No problem. No problem. I'll check through. Yeah. So in the continent, as you know, some of you might have noticed, is that one of the key drivers of our African Continental Free Trade Agreement is the investment on infrastructure. We have opportunities on transport, both road, in fact, the three of them, rail, road, as well as water, that is in the form of ports, so that as we improve from 18% of intra-Africa trade, moving towards the 50s that Your Excellency Mene talked about, those key will be enablers. However, controlling and underlying all these is the need for electricity generation. And in the African continent, we are providing opportunities across various modes of energy generation. In fact, what we've done in the continent, as we've seen in Canada and many other countries in the world, is that there's been a transition in the electricity generation sector from the traditional model of vertically integrated companies, such as in South Africa's Eskom, where you've got your generation, your transmission, as well as your distribution being owned by one entity, where many African countries have vertically unbundled. Those that have vertically unbundled in the continent is countries such as Ethiopia, Uganda, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe, amongst others. However, countries like South Africa, Namibia, and Morocco still have got vertically integrated models. However, what they've done very, very well is to introduce competition on the generation side. And how they do that is bring in a transition from fossil fuel-based generation capacity into renewable, so that Africa, as it integrates into a free trade area, it also makes a telling message in its climate contribution, both on the energy side, but also on the food security side. What is emerging in the continent is really that the variable renewable energy is increasing at a very fast pace. And what we're seeing is that in the integration process of the continent, of interconnectedness through the electricity grid that cut across the whole continent. For example, in Southern Africa, we've got the Southern African Power Pool that integrates almost most of the countries within the SADC region, except of course the island-based countries such as Mauritius, Seychelles, as well as Madagascar. The rest of the Southern African Development Community is integrated into this Southern African Power Pool. The strategy is to integrate the whole continent to ensure that each and every country has got capability in terms of generating, but also of buying electricity so that to satisfy its own demand, should it need to, through a very competitive mechanism, which allows each and every country to produce, at the same time to buy and sell power in an integrated framework. And that integrated transmission will require a lot of investment, which I believe that a number of our Canadian friends may see them attractive to work with us and partner with us. So what in the continent we're looking at within integrating our electricity and interconnectivity of the grid is to ensure that we build smart, complex, and very flexible system that can also support our variable renewable technology, meaning that the instability of the grid will require its own technology to ensure stability as we mix from solar, water, as well as wind into the traditional fossil fuel type of generation which still exists in the continent. At the back of this electricity technology, there's also an underlay of mobile and blockchain payment technologies, because most of our consumers are also using to pay their own mobile technology using the blockchain payment technologies. So through that system, not only are we providing opportunities on the generation side, on the transmission, as well as flexible systems, technologies. We also for mobile technology that allows payments for consumers specifically. This is what we're trying to develop, and we're opening up opportunities in our integration efforts of the continent. Where we see ourselves in the near future, we're working with Canadians as partners for many of our members in the African Continental Free Trade Area, is really ensuring that in our electricity interconnectivity, we plan a flexible and durable model working with you so that we're able to be flexible by ensuring that our policymakers provide the right regulatory framework, where they ensure that there is a market available and that you institute the required institutional reforms that are required to attract investors. For example, in South Africa, through our integrated resource plan, we are engaged in an institutional reform mechanism where the generation part of ESCOM will stand alone and will have competition, will have the transmission side that stands alone, which will also be a market operator buying electricity from generators who are private to be public, so that it procures electricity at the cheapest price possible. And that market operator then will sell to the distribution market, which will also want to procure at the cheapest cost possible, lowering the cost of manufacturing and enables Africa to embark on industrialization so that we can be able, through investment in manufacturing, ensuring that our manufacturing base is increased tremendously away from primary production into manufacturing as we integrate the continent. That will require, of course, the development of complex and efficient metering opportunities, billing system, and development capacity. We should believe that working with our Canadian partners, we should be able to achieve it in integrating our economy, ensuring that by 2030, we're integrated as a region, we offer value for investors, we've got a diverse and dynamic market across many areas, from primary commodities such as agriculture, our endowment with metals and soft and hard commodities, as well as manufacturing to satisfy the young African market that is emerging, that's growing and dynamic. And in the process, ensure that your investment is a Canadian in the Africa, is a partnership. And together, we ensure that we interconnect and have a cross-border trade power, and we make money for you as a Canadian investor, whilst at the same time ensure that the African continent integrates, succeeds, and the Africa's potential is achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mondi. We've got some great comments and questions coming through. One of them relates to your presentation, Mr. Mondi, on some of those institutional reforms. It's a comment that both the Fraser Institute and several South African policy experts have collaborated on a document. I've been asked to share that with you in case you haven't seen it, speaking specifically to energy. I'll certainly do that. Another question related to your presentation, Deepak. Do you see some support emerging for SMEs in light of this free trade deal, some support within the market specifically to helping with sources of collateral so that SMEs can take advantage of supply chains and markets beyond just the country of origin?
Yes, in fact, I should point out that over the last 3 to 4 weeks, we've had approaches from a multitude of development institutions based in Europe who have called us up to talk about how they could capitalize agencies such as ours. And one of the two of the key things that they want to talk about is our support for renewable energy, and the other is our support for small and medium enterprises. Now, I should say that, again, some of us working on the paradigm that we used to have a few years ago, when they first contacted us, our response was, we're a commercial agency. We don't get engaged in debt forgiveness programs, because they were calling us around the time or asking us for meetings around the time of the publicity around Africa's debt problems a few weeks ago. And they got back to us and said, no, we know exactly what you do, and we actually want to invest in you, because for every dollar we put into you, somewhere between $15 to $18 goes out the door. What we want to know is, can you make sure that it's SMEs that get supported? And is it possible to channel some of your funding towards infrastructure related to renewable energy? And so we have the German government through KfW and the European Union through the European Union that support, through the European Investment Bank, that support our Africa Energy Guarantee Fund and the Renewable Energy Liquidity Support Facility in the RE space. On the SME side, I confess that a couple of our partner institutions like Trade and Development Bank and AfriExim have closer links directly with SME businesses through private debt funds that they have sponsored and set up to support some of those businesses. For an institution like ourselves or the Africa Guarantee Fund, another sister institution, we mostly focus on indirect support for SMEs to get into those value chains, because we will often support, or we will credit enhance loan portfolios or trade receivable portfolios or local currency receivables portfolios for that matter, at a bank level or at a microfinancial level, so that some of those SMEs find access to credit and access to working capital easier to come by. The opportunities will be huge. The point is that institutions like ours are now having to recalibrate towards that, because we were originally set up to help the growth of infrastructure related to exports, which for a long time meant warehouses and railway lines and ports and shipping cranes and things like that. We're now being asked to recalibrate towards making sure that employment is enhanced on the continent. And so that's where we are seeing the SME opportunity, and the sort of institutions that partner with us expect us to do that. So we are certainly working very hard towards taking those products which were a small part of our portfolios and making them a bigger part of our portfolios and strengthening our internal abilities to service some of that demand.
Thanks very much. We've got a request that some of the access to resources and links and organizations that each of you have spoken of, if the Chamber can share that, we certainly will. We'll get that from both of you and put that on our website as well as in the follow-up email to that event. A question related to existing or historic Canadian investment. Canada has led in the mining sector with investment. Unfortunately, the sector hasn't got a good reputation when it's come to cases of human rights abuse, even if not necessarily Canadian companies involved. But as Canada expands its trade footprint and replicates what it's done in mining across a host of sectors, the question is, how does the Canada-Africa relationship better enable, or how can it better enable the human rights component that happens alongside doing business on the African continent? And the question's being directed to either one of you.
I can certainly say that from our perspective, we follow extremely strict rules tied to some of the institutions that are our shareholders. So, for example, the African Development Bank safeguarding principles and the IFC's ESG, rules for protecting environmental, social, and governance standards all have to be adhered to in any transactions that we do. And I know that a lot of our sister institutions as well over the last years have strengthened that capability. So we are able to require that transactions meet the highest possible standards in each of our member countries. Given our shareholding, our shareholders, it also means that we have direct links into ministries and into government offices in each of our member countries, where we can certainly push the case much harder than we would perhaps 15 or 20 years ago when we were first founded. And our voice is now listened to, given the amount of leverage that we have on the continent, given our financial, the standards we have set financially. For example, in our case at ATI, we are rated A and A3 by Standard & Poor's and Moody's respectively. We have to maintain that rating at the highest levels to enable our business model to work. And so it is in our interest to follow the highest principles that we can, and to make sure that any investors that do transactions through us or with us have the comfort and that we are going to make sure that transactions we get involved in adhere to the highest principles. We have not hesitated to cut deals out that were not achieving the impact that we would like to see in the past, and we would not hesitate to do so in future if we felt any of those standards were being abused.
I've been very fortunate that I've worked with Dlamini in South Africa, specifically in the greater Johannesburg area of South Africa, which has got one of the world's richest platinum reserves. But also with Barrick in Eritrea, when I work for the Industrial Development Corporation. So that enabled us, in fact, when I work for a development institution, which I think our colleagues at the African Development Bank also would like to encourage, is that one of the ways of offsetting abuse or any perceived abuse, ensuring that our partners subscribe to human rights or the international regulation ranging from human to environment to sustainability, is working with development finance institutions that are on the ground. So I'll encourage that the DFIs, most of them who understand the environment in areas where you're looking for investment in the continent, play a very critical role to de-risk, but also to ensure that the institutional environment, that is the regulation that comes from government, is abide by, or where there are weaknesses, that they assist in ensuring that those weaknesses are addressed, so that an entrepreneur or a company such as Barrick or Dlamini is able to operate and do what it does best, which is mining. I just want to conclude this point by saying that also the Canadian Stock Exchange has been excellent in terms of allowing a number of African companies and specs to be listed, to raise funding for African projects. And I think the Canadian government, if it continues to allow entrepreneurs who have got projects both in agriculture and other areas to list some of the specs in the Canadian Stock Exchange, will really propel our integration and make us succeed.
Thank you very much for both those answers. And thanks to each one of you again for joining us for this session, looking at some of the business perspectives on the trade opportunities we've discussed. It's been a great honor to host each one of you, and certainly a great honor for all of you, hundreds of you across the continent and across Canada, who've been with us throughout this call today. We had 400 registrants, so a big thank you to you again for joining us. And certainly for the comments and the questions. I think three key themes have come out to summarize this engagement that we've been privileged to have co-hosted with the South African High Commission. And they are as follows: that Canada is a trusted third party on the continent and certainly can continue in its partnership both ways in sharing expertise and enabling the ongoing promotion and implementation of free trade. Second, that there's huge interest clearly on the comments in the idea of Canada-Africa free trade deal in due course with a single African market. One individual over in Niger describing it as it would be the best deal in the world, and certainly excellent sentiment. But finally, it's the businesses that are going to make it happen. It's the entrepreneurs who take risks. It's all of those of you who may have many sleepless nights in pursuit of building a business and putting your heart and soul into creating ventures that spur economic development and enable the process of economic growth. And so none of this would happen without that entrepreneurial role in society that each one of you play. Thank you very much once again. This video is on record, and what an honor it has been once again to be with each one of you. I don't think there's a province or a country on the continent that is not represented on this call from what I can see on the participant list. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Gareth?
Yes.
Gareth? Yeah, just a separate point. I'd be happy if you deem it appropriate, and of course, if it's possible to actually physically do so. If you'd like to send through any questions that were specific that you think I could answer, I'd be happy to slowly go through them and get some answers out as the days go by. I realize you can't have curated that many people's worth of questions, but if you think that that's something people would appreciate, I'd be happy to do it. Just a side note.
Thank you very much. We would be delighted to do that. There are many, many questions. So I invite anyone who has questions after this call to also add those questions. You can email them to me, and I'll pass them on to both Mr. Mondi and Mr. Dave. My email address is gareth@canadaafrica.ca, and it's also on the Canada Africa website, and each of you will receive a follow-up email from me as well. Thank you very much for participating. And in fact, I'll take the liberty, even though it's not scheduled, to perhaps give the final closing word to somebody who I've come to know incredibly well, and what a privilege it's been to work with you, High Commissioner Dlamini-Mntambo.
Gareth, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear, Your Excellency.
Okay, just wanted to say thank you so much to all our speakers. This really was very, very informative, and for accepting to be part of this engagement today. And to our audiences, thank you for making time to join us on this webinar today. And again, I cannot thank you, Gareth. I cannot thank you enough. My office really worked with you seamlessly. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Your Excellency. And we look forward to seeing each one of you again at a future event. We've got dozens of webinars coming up, and we'll be sure to keep you posted. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Gareth.
Bye-bye. See you.